Hello, and welcome back to another episode of Not D&D this week. D&D is brought to you by EN Live, part of EN World, which is the leading tabletop news and reviews site. I'm the host, Jessica, but much more excitingly with me, I have two guests again this week. I have Sam and Zach from Soul Muppet Publishing here to talk about their game, Orbital Blues. Sam, for people that don't know you for some reason, could you introduce yourself and tell us what you do?
So my name is Sam Sleney. I wrote Orbital Blues with Zach. I pitched him in a pub a couple of years ago.
Good place for a
and
pitch.
said, "Hey, I want to make a game about sad space cowboys," and he was like, "I'm in." I used to work full time in RPGs, but I got hella burnt out and bailed. I dabble now as a freelancer, frequently working with Zach. Before that, I was the creative director of First Fallen Leaf Publishing, which did like more trad style RPGs. Yeah, that's me in terms of who I am in relation to role-playing games.
Excellent. I'll dig in and ask you more questions in a bit about your background with RPGs.
Absolutely.
For sure. But before we get into that, Zach, could you tell us who you are?
Hey, my name's Zach. I run Soul Muppet Publishing, which is an indie RPG company that focuses on creating both our stuff in-house and also bringing to people games around the world and helping stuff see print that might not see print otherwise. I've written a couple of games, obviously co-wrote Blues with Sam, and my other game is called Best Left Buried, which is a fantasy horror game. But I also do a lot of work as a project manager and publisher of other games. Like a producer is sort of my job title for a lot of stuff. I've done a lot of work with Roanoke and Deckard. And so when you had Kieran and Grant on the podcast last month to talk about Die, I was involved quite a lot in that project as well. So my thing is working with really creative people like Sam and helping books appear in the world.
That sounds
He's
brilliant.
very good at it. If you've got an idea, get in touch.
Sounds like a good pitch for that there. If
or
you
maybe
do have
don't.
any...
Maybe he's too busy. I'm not sure.
I'll let us back speak for themselves later. So as you can see on the banner in the chat now, if you have any questions, please do pop them in the chat and we will answer them through the next hour. This is going to be kind of an informal kind of chat, so feel free to ask any questions and jump in throughout the stream. So Sam, you briefly mentioned a little bit about your background with RPGs, but could we dig into that a little bit more now? I was going to ask you, what was the first RPG you played or your first introduction to role-playing games?
So I was one of those kids who picked up sticks with other kids and we hit each other with them. So we were like LARPing from the get-go.
Excellent.
It was very imaginative. When I was in secondary school, I got turned on to my local game store by a friend who wanted to just go check it out and see what it was all about. I went along with him and got roped into a role-playing game group, and it molded my young child brain, turned it into paste, and I couldn't stop playing or thinking about RPGs since then. I've always been really creative. I used to do this really creepy thing as a child where I would like whisper stories to myself like some kind of possessed demon. They gave me an outlet for that, and I'm not very good at sticking to prose per se. I studied literature at university and went on to do a master's in creative writing, all the whilst finding excuses to explain RPGs and role-playing, like the role-playing game experience to my lecturers, professors, etc. They must have got sick of me, I'm sure. They were just like,
really
talk about real books.
It
was really funny because after I graduated, I went back to see one of my professors and slapped a big role-playing game book on the desk, and I was like, I've sent that all over the world and published it and you can go buy it in shops. And she was like, oh, I haven't published a book. And I was like, well, I have. Um, so yeah, it became real then. The first RPG I ever played was Warhammer Fantasy Role-Playing 2nd Edition. I've been a massive fan of Warhammer since I was too young. So getting into that, when I first appeared at the local game store, they were like, hey, do you want to play a role-playing game? Do you want to play it in a world that you recognize, or do you want us to make something up? We've got this, this, and this. One of the things was Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, so I was just like, yeah, that. And played that. Really enjoyed how janky and just random and fun it was. After that, went on to Exalted 2nd Edition, which was much more like mechanically dense and chunky, very combat heavy, although the dude who ran it was very rules light with it. So it was like high fantasy, high power, low rules, and that sort of got me into a very as much as those are quite mechanically dense trad games, I was very fortunate that the DM that I had was very rules light, adopting and adapting stuff on the fly just to keep the story going. And that's what got me into essentially story games that prioritize narrative over rules. And yeah, that since then I've just gone from various things to another. I think I've been running games now for about 15 years, which is almost half my life. I'm 27. So yeah, been at it a while. Churned out a couple of books on the way. They're all right. They're all right. I've got an award, so
that's your review. They're all right.
They're good. And yeah, that's me. At the minute, I am playing a game. It's just a fantasy RPG that runs on Black Hack. And yeah, that's what I'm up to at the minute.
So fair to say you quite like RPGs then. So
yeah. On one hand, you could say it changed my life. On the other hand, ruined my life. On the other, sort of.
Yeah, I think everyone
irrevocably.
Everyone that works in RPGs kind of says that for sure. Zach, what about you? What's your kind of history with RPGs? Do you remember what your first experience in gaming was?
Yeah, like my story is actually really similar to Sam's. I also got started playing Warhammer Fantasy Role-Playing 2nd Edition. I would say I didn't play that game at all. I think I read the book and was trying to play it with my brother at the age of like 9 or 10. And it's quite complicated. And no one had ever explained to me what a role-playing game was. So it was a mixture of like using the games to run weird skirmish combats and trying to run a campaign in a 45-minute lunch break at school in the school wargaming club, where I was trying to convince all my friends that played Warhammer 40k to play a Dark Heresy game for us, which is a game, again, it's another Warhammer licensed RPG with a similar engine. I then fell out of it for about 5-10 years and kind of didn't get back into it after that, being at that quite young age and not really doing it properly. And then had a brief run-in that was maybe like a year to 18 months with Dungeons & Dragons. I was playing 5th edition at the time, and then fell into what I make currently mostly through games of what people call the old school tradition, which is I was playing a lot of stuff like Black Hack, a lot of stuff like Knave, Maze Rats was my favourite, and then I wrote my first role-playing game not long after that, which is Best F Buried, which is kind of belonging in that old school tradition, but also borrowing a lot of mechanics and rituals, basically, from more narrative-based story games. So about combining two types of indie role-playing you see a lot, which are these story games and these old school games, and that's where the tradition of stuff like Orbital Blues and Best F Buried comes from, where we're kind of trying to take the resolution mechanics of an old school game and then tying them to the rich role-playing campaign mechanics that you will find in a story game. So it's about taking something that's very short and snappy and rules light, and then adding some structure on top of it to kind of weave an elaborate campaign system where your characters grow and progress over time. But yeah, that's so yeah, a similar woofer up, then some story games, and then into what we did now. Hey, looks like Jess has vanished from the stream. Are you seeing that as well, Sam?
We don't have a host anymore. We're the hosts now.
Okay. Oh. Don't know if we should pop ourselves on
Don't know
mute.
where she's gone.
Yeah, it's just us on the
Guess
stream.
we're in charge of EN World now.
This is how the takeover starts.
Yeah.
Do we ask each other questions?
What do you love about Woof-Rup or Warhammer Fantasy role-playing, Zach?
I think my favourite thing about Warhammer Fantasy role-playing is, in fact, the career system, which would be when you start the game, you roll a D100 based on the class that you're in, and then it just gives you a profession that you are within Warhammer's old world, which is got a weird Germanic fantasy realm. And instead of playing in D&D, for example, you would be a fighter or a wizard or a cleric. Your jobs are stuff like tollkeeper or woodsman or tax collector. Or
they're all very high and mighty stations you've got there, Zach. You're much more likely to roll, I don't know, a grave robber or a trash picker or a bloke who hangs around on roads asking for change.
Yeah, which is just such a different expectation of fantasy than what you would get if you were those sort of like more high fantasy careers. And it creates a much more rustic and not very many teeth feeling to your role-playing game sessions.
And you definitely don't play as a character who has very many teeth.
You're right, Jess. We were just
I am back. Thank you very much for filling the air. My internet died, which is the first time this has happened doing this show ever, which is great. So thank you very much for filling the time there. But yeah, so you were talking a little bit about when you were starting, getting into working on Best Left Buried as well before you cut out, and then talked about Warhammer Fantasy excellently. But I want to talk about that game because that is kind of the system that's based on Orbital Blues, if I'm correct, that we're here to talk about today. So Zach, if you could give us an elevator pitch on what Orbital Blues is, how would you pitch it to people?
So Orbital Blues is a game about sad space cowboys. You play itinerant, self-employed people who all live on a spaceship together. You are the crew of a Firefly or Cowboy Bebop or sort of like Star Wars Guardians of the Galaxy-esque ship. You fly around the galaxy trying to make ends meet, doing whatever work you have to do. You often end up turning to crime and just trying to do what you can to pay the bills and make sure you can afford your bell peppers and beef and keep the spaceship running, basically. It's a game that is infused with lots of Americana. It's a Western. It's not really a science fiction game as we see it. It's a lot more, more of a Western that just happens to be set in space in the far future.
You're much more likely to get into a gunfight with someone wearing a Stetson than you are a robot.
Yeah,
sounds amazing.
Absolutely. And an important part of the game is that because of the horrible situation that you are in trying to make these end meets in this big, sad, bluesy space, is that your characters in Dungeons and Dragons, you might get experience and level up by fighting monsters or getting money. In Orbital Blues, you get experience for being sad. And every character...
Oh wow, that's the aim of the game. Okay.
Exactly. Comes with something called a trouble, which is the reason that you have the blues. And so your character might be a space alcoholic, or have a problem with being really violent, or have a backstory to do with their relationships with crime and criminal enterprise. And from these troubles, you're kind of generating a sort of a background for yourself that's kind of filled in as you play, and you get to add like flashback details and say, oh, I've been to this space system before. I used to drink in this bar if you're an alcoholic. So you'll have a move where, if you arrive in a new spaceport, you can be able to say, well, this is the bar I used to drink at here if you've got your buried in the bottle. I think that's what it's called, something like that, ability. And they also allow you to make contacts and just role play the reasons out that your character is really sad, and sometimes create new skills and stuff like that, because it's a game that is very much about more about storytelling than about trying to like win. Which is something that's really important to us as some of it.
Definitely. And it's described as a rules light system, which is always great for me, because that means it's going to give you a chance to kind of explore characters, explore the world, and role play a little bit more, which is why when you asked to come on and we talked about this, I was like, yes, let's definitely talk about that. Sam, you mentioned you pitched this game in a pub, and we're like, let's make a game about sad space cowboys. And of course, who wouldn't take that pitch? But what was your inspiration for making it? Were you yourself sad in space once, or?
So I am a big fan of Cowboy Bebop. My main route into writing was music. I grew up with a very musical background, very wide, varied music taste, but something that's always been like prevalent in my life is like blues, country, bluegrass, Americana, that kind of stuff. And I've always used music in my role-playing games, always been inspired by music. When people say like, oh, is there a piece of writing that got you into writing, is a very popular question in like writing circles. My answer sort of raises a few eyebrows, because it's not actually a book, it's Jungle Land by Bruce Springsteen. Is probably like my biggest inspiration for what started me writing. That or his song Youngstown. There's a line that always sticks with me about smokestacks reaching like the arms of God into the fiery furnaces of hell, talking about a foundry. And that was something that was really evocative to me, like as a kid. I thought it was like really powerful imagery, and that was like my route into writing. So I've worked on role-playing games, like my own sort of stuff, spitballing, DIY, that I only shared with my friends for a long time. And then sort of around 2015, 2016, I was introduced to someone at my local game store who had like an idea for a game. And essentially they just needed someone to take it over the finish line, to like edit it, line read it, make it look nice, market it, clean it up around the edges, just somewhat like my skill set slotted into it. And so I did that. That game became Sins, which is an award-winning supernatural post-apocalyptic role-playing game. And I was about to go into my usual convention pitch. I haven't done it in years, but I probably could be Manchurian candidate to reciting it. And that did all right. Obviously, never left behind that sort of like musical influence, but I didn't really get the chance to do that with that. And I had a lot of ideas bubbling up inside me. I got very burnt out, very despondent, and quite tired of like the gig economy of being a freelance writer. I was going through like quite a rough patch in my life at the time, and I started writing these ideas down for like a very despondent, sort of bluesy game that captured the loneliness, the vibe, but the general despondent, I don't want to call it nihilistic, but definitely detached sort of tone that Cowboy Bebop has in some of its less humorous episodes. And also infusing it with like my love of blues and Americana. And I had to put that into a bite-sized pitch, and do something with that idea, because it was just sort of rattling around my head for a long time. And I had worked with Zach quite literally in our day jobs, and playing role-playing games together. And I know that he was expanding his publishing arm at the time, where after Best Left Buried, and the success of that. And so I said to him, I was like, look, I've got a game for Sad Space Cowboys. It's not a game that I can do with the team that did Sins. They're very trad, and frankly, I just don't think that they're the right minds for it. And I want to do this, and I want a sort of outlet for this. Can you just give me carte blanche to go crazy with this? I know the right people to work on this. So I brought in Josh Clark, who's a good friend of mine, to do the art. Zach found layout and editing. and also helped with the mechanics because it was based off Best Left Buried. I am actually a bit of a fraud, to be honest, because whilst this is a sci-fi game, I'm very much a fantasy guy.
Okay.
So, and I'm definitely not a mechanics guy, but Zach is. Zach, they're very good at mechanics. So all the ideas I had for mechanics, I pitched to Zach, and they morphed them into something that had a good game feel about it. And it just sort of evolved. It took a while to get out because we had a pandemic.
We did.
I moved house. The world sort of collapsed, but we got there in the end. And it exists now. I actually don't have a copy that I can hold up in front of the camera.
Well, I have an image I can put on the screen right here. It looks just
there
like
you go.
that. There we go. Zach's got it. There you go.
Some other bits we do. I haven't got a cassette with me. I do.
I have a cassette.
UK Games Expo. You should have talked about in the music. The other
we should talk about the cassette because the cassette is definitely an example of insanity. So I'm really big into cassettes as a thing. I know the cool thing is to collect vinyl, but I used to collect cassettes because I'm a hipster.
Just a 90s kid.
And I said to Zach when we were doing the Kickstarter, I was like, I think we should do something like cool that people remember that nobody's done before.
I think I remember how the conversation happened. I was watching all the vinyl RPGs that came out in 2019, and I said, "Oh, that was really cool. Maybe we should do an Orbital Blues vinyl because that's kind of on vibe." And then Sam was like, "No, it has to be a cassette because part of the aesthetic of Orbital Blues is that you are basically a space trucker, right? That's quite a lot of the imagery that we rely on during the game. So we got a friend of ours, Chris Bissett. They are a very talented musician and make music for a lot of their games. And we were like, could you make us an album? We don't really mind what goes on it as long as it fits the vibe because Orbital Blues covers such a huge range of musical inspirations. And like, for example, Sam, a lot of your stuff is like Bruce Springsteen, Bob Dylan, some other bits in that kind of country genre.
Yeah, the really cool thing is that me and Zach both have different visions for Orbital Blues, like what the universe sounds like, essentially. I have this weird headcanon that talking heads would be really big in Orbital Blues, and I can't explain why. It's very sort of it's weird. Like mine's bluesy and rhythm and blues. Zach's is more jazz infused, and I think that's something that I would really sort of extol to anyone listening. Is it's a game meant to be played with music, with like real foot stompers and things that you think make for cool moments. One thing that I wrote in. And then Zach polished up the edges of is that players can do a swan song, which is essentially when you make your character, you pick a signature song for them that sort of encapsulates them. And when a character reaches the end of their story, you can do a swan song wherein their song plays and they get a ton of buffs and abilities to really like go out with a meaningful bang that allows the party to take something from their departure. It's not always a death. It might just be like a retirement or they fly off, something like that. But it makes for those, it helps you construct those moments that people talk about for months, if not years, afterwards a role-playing game, and it gives you some mechanical clout for doing those things.
It sounds really cinematic, like in a movie. It's the moment in the movie where the hero looks back and like, I got this, go on without me.
Yeah.
That's exactly what we're trying to replicate. And your characters level up in Orbital Blues, where they get sad enough to have one of those really emotional scenes, and they have to act out in an emotional way, either through an argument with a friend or an act of violence or like a climactic moment. And only at that point can you advance and then get a bunch of new abilities. But like the music was just so important to us during creation. Not only did we have this soundtrack made, but a lot of the art that Josh does is, so the way that Josh makes the art is that he takes images and then public domain photography normally, and then kit bashes it into and draws over it and smashes them all together and makes something really impressive looking. Sometimes that looks like a sort of dusty barren with a spaceship on the top of it, or sort of a space station that's actually been made out of a lampshade or something. Or you get a NASA imagery of a bunch of neon signs painted over it, because we've pulled those from pictures of roadside stuff in America and then pushed it on there. But also a lot of the imagery, the art from the book is actually like diegetic in-world art. So there's lots of posters, and they might be like band posters for a gig that's going to happen at the New Haven spaceport. And
or adverts.
Or adverts for companies that don't exist that sell spacesuits, right? Where Josh has taken a advert from the 50s where somebody's selling suits and then kit bashed onto that character a spacesuit, right? With that same kind of like Mad Men advertising vibes. So, but then what we did is that, because we knew we were going to make a cassette, we said to Chris, hey, here's the band posters for all the bands that we've made in Orbital Blues. Why don't you go and make an album for one of these in-universe bands? So Deltas, who are the music group that Chris was cosplaying as when they made the cassette, is actually a band with posters in Orbital Blues and some backstory. And the other character, Holly Astro and the Flyboys, who has a couple of posters in the book that Josh has done, they appear in the start adventure. So, you know, there's lots of weird examples where we just really indulged ourselves when making cool references to the music that happens. Yeah. And when we've made new adventures, which we started to publish for Orbital Blues, we ask the writer, because they're normally the new creative force we're adding, we've kept Josh illustrating all of the books, to relate to the music that's important to them and make that be what happens. So the adventure that one of our writers, Giuliano Roverato, has done is called, and apologies, I'm going to say this wrong because I'm not Latin American, Chega de Saudade, which is a sort of a type of Brazilian folk music. Fado, I'm not sure. And that's about sad longing and nostalgia.
For something that never existed.
Exactly. So that then becomes the hook for the adventure. And some of the other things we've had written have been based on 1980s pop. And that playlist, we'll put a little bit ly in the book, and you can listen to the playlist the writer was listening to as they wrote it, right?
Nice.
And
if you look in the right place, you can find Sam's playlist.
I've actually just posted that to Jess so she can share it. But,
should I put it in the main chat? It's a Spotify playlist.
Orbital Blues has a Spotify playlist coming up to 400 followers, I think, and it's my Spotify playlist that I used when writing the game. That's what the game sounds like to me, and that's all real music. It's not fictional music that we had made. That's all a massive list of tracks, artists that inspired Orbital Blues and what it sounds like to me and what I was listening to when I was writing and making the book with the team. Give that a follow. It's got some bangers on there, if I do say so myself.
That's awesome. If you're listening to the podcast, that'll be in the show notes there. And if you're watching live, I've just put it in the chat there so you can watch the link there. That's really good. I was going to ask if there was a Spotify or something, because whilst the cassette is very awesome, I don't know about everyone else watching, but I personally no longer have a cassette player.
Nobody does.
I'm not as cool as Sam and Zach.
I don't have a cassette player. That's ridiculous. I just look at them and go, these are neat. I haven't had one in years, but I also stripped back my cassette collection a couple of years ago because they're pointless dead media.
It's about having that weird art object, right?
Absolutely.
Obviously, I've paid for like 700-800 of them.
not that anyone on the listening to the podcast can see it. I don't even think Zach knows that I have this. But when I left York to live in Nottingham a couple of years ago, Josh, who did the art for Orbital Blues, actually made me a cassette mix, an actual cassette tape, essentially, full of songs, and recorded it himself by putting a tape recorder next to a CD player, like the old style.
The classic way, like you would do that on the radio. Yeah.
So it's got a couple of tracks on. It's got a side A, a side B, and that still is it's on my cupboard, on my shelf of special things. It's very nice. I love cassettes and I love retro paraphernalia, but not like the things that are typically cool, like vinyls, for example. Instead, I'm into cassettes.
Well, hey, everyone has things they like. It's really great to hear that music was such an inspiration to the game, and that you've pushed that out into the game mechanically. With the Swan song you spoke about, and also that you've made it accessible to the community as well with the playlist. That's really nice to see for the game. Jumping back into the game a little bit, I wanted to go kind of through the system in case people aren't familiar with Best Left Buried. So Zach, it's a D6 based kind of system, and you've got kind of 3 basic stats with it. Could you talk us through kind of the base mechanics of the game?
Yeah, so we've borrowed a lot of the basic mechanics from Best Left Buried, but the way the game works is essentially it's a 2d6 system. You're rolling 2 dice and adding one of your 3 stats to the to what you've rolled. You're trying to hit a target number of 8, and you can, to make situations easier and harder, rather than the target number shifting, you might be rolling with advantage, which we call having the upper hand, or disadvantage, which we call being against the odds. And your GM will kind of make the call on that based on the fictional situation, how difficult things are meant to be. You also have the main thing that might be a bit weird if you're coming from a different RPG is that your ship has its own stats, and there's quite a detailed sort of set of rules on how to do a ship combat, should they be fighting each other, in a way that makes sure all the characters have something cool and narrative to do, rather than just the person flying the darn thing. The sort of thing that makes Orbital Blues spaceships a bit weird is that they don't all have guns, because you're kind of explicitly not using military ships and they're all civilian ships. So you might have like some grappling hooks or a mining laser or something like that, but it's unlikely that you're going to have some like big torpedo launcher kind of thing that you might experience in other sort of space dogfighting media. But a lot of the stuff that we did for the system is about, and the main difference from Best Left Buried is the stuff I was talking about earlier, to do with the swan songs and the troubles brewing and your troubles. And the point that, you do get experience and level up by your character being really sad. And you're sort of answering these prompts that come as part of your character sheet. And over time, your character will sort of probably get even more sad as things go on, as they start to pick up new troubles from things going wrong.
Life happens to you, and you end up sort of becoming more world weary and jaded as the adventures go on, but that in turn makes you more inured to the hardships of the galaxy. It was very much inspired by the fact that writing was making me miserable, but when I was miserable, I was doing my best writing, and I thought, actually, this is a strength, and I should turn this into something that can be of use somewhere. And so I think I pitched it to Zach, or they summarized it as sad for XP was what we ended up calling it.
XP. Okay.
Yeah, that was what the draft notes were on the Google Drive for a long time. Were just brackets sad for XP.
Gold for XP is for cowards. Sad for XP is where it lives.
Sad for XP. Not to trivialize that sort of thing.
No, of course.
I suffer with mental health issues out of the wazoo. But it was a way for me to sort of tackle that and, I guess, come to terms with it and make something of it of value. Zach really helped to sort of, I don't want to say gamify it, because I think gamifying something tends to have it makes things sound trivial sometimes. But definitely sort of mechanized it essentially in a way that could be tracked rather than just my wife died, so I start at level 2, that kind of thing. It's not like that. It's more, our crew have been through some stuff, and now I always need a smoke before a gunfight. But in turn, I have a much steadier aim, and I'm a dead shot.
Yeah, there is a real emphasis in Orbital Blues that, and I tried to take this from our other games as well. What I always said for playing Best Left Buried is that it's a horror game, and it's really hard to be scared when you're doing maths and you're thinking about rules. So the game is not a rules-based experience. It is a vibes-based experience. And what little rules we have are helping to abstract out some situations so you can run something like a combat or a skill check quickly and cleanly and get out of the way so we can focus on those vibes-led experience, because it's about telling these beautiful stories. And at the end of the day, I think Sam will agree with this, the game is about our experiences under capitalism as people in a gig economy with mental health problems, and that is what Orbital Blues is about. And it's about our reflections of our experiences in those kind of situations. Obviously, we're not in space, we don't do crime, but writing role-playing games is a being artists generally, to use a big word for what I do, which is mainly logistics and publishing, when somebody doesn't ask me to help them with a role-playing game like Sam was so helpful to do. But yeah, it's about our relationship with those things. And it sounds like a bit of a bleak story, but it can be something incredibly beautiful and satisfying. And what we're trying to do is write a game where the game gets out the way as much as possible and lets you tell a thematic and really beautiful story.
Zach's definitely hit the nail on the head there. It's about sort of, I can't think of a better word than drudgery. Is something that keeps coming back to my mind. Is one thing, like as I said previously, the main thing that inspired me was just trying to get by in a gig economy, and especially over the last 6 years in Britain, where everything's just kind of got worse. And I was helping to run my own company. I don't do that anymore because I just couldn't. It just was no longer feasible. And my mental health wasn't doing great, and I wanted to put that into something like an outlet in some way. And the thing that I am good at is role-playing games. So I took my love of music, my experience with mental health problems, poverty, etc., and just blended them all up into this big Cowboy Bebop-ish soup. And
delicious.
Presented it to Zach and said, you wanna sell this? And they said, yeah, looks good.
So when we're telling the main thing about the game is telling these stories, and it sounds like the characters and what they experience and go through in their moments is kind of the central thing in this. So what goes into creating a character for the game? Zach, I don't know if you want to talk about how you approach kind of making a character for these stories.
The bits of the game that we wrote were split into a very clear section based on if it was rules based or vibes based. And Sam did all the vibes and I did all the rules. So the first thing that happens is you pick a name. Your Orbital Blues characters tend to just have one name and it sounds like a surname. So I can't think of any examples off the top of my head, but it's the same way that all the characters in Bebop and Firefly tend to refer to each other by
a pseudonym. I think, if I recall, I wrote about how you go by something. Like it could be a moniker, a pseudonym, it could be your surname, it could just become what you've become known by. But and maybe you have more than one name, but just to ease into things for the ease of role playing, it's just one name, and you also have a title as well. Yeah, so this is one of my favorite parts of the book, and essentially it's a big list of just like titles for yourself that you would be known by in a sort of heist movie sort of way. The thing that inspired that was, I think, Run the Jewels 4 had just come out, Yankee and the Brave, and I was like listening to that whilst writing, and I was like, ooh yeah, monikers are cool. So that went in there, and Zach was like, should we put it in a table? And I was like, no, just spill it all over the page, and people can just see what jumps out at them, and put everything in a different font, because then you can like really envision it in your mind in a sort of like, I hate to use this as an example, and maybe I'm the only person who's ever used this, but like Guy Ritchie's Rock and Roller, which is a terrible film, but it had a very sort of like punchy visual style, which I don't think was new for the time, but it definitely had one. And you could sort of really imagine in a visual sense a character being introduced, and it freeze framing with their name, and then the driver underneath it, or the muscle, that kind of thing, and they go hand in hand, and that shapes your character's identity, which you then sort of develop into stats. Handing over back to Zach.
So you pick some brilliant stuff like that. There's a couple of stats. We have muscle, grit, and savvy. Those are then followed by picking what is called a gambit, which is just like a short one-line ability that says something about what your character does on the spaceship. Right? They might be a mechanic, or a hustler, or a gunfighter, or just a whole selection of lists like that. And then you also pick one of the 18 troubles I was talking about earlier, which is the reason that you are a particularly sad space cowboy. You grab a couple of extra bits like that, like a couple of weapons, and maybe some bits of like sci-fi based equipment that are going to help your characters out by doing crime. Sam wrote a big list of weird scanners and spaceship bits, and there's some rules about building your own weapon as well by giving it tags and stuff like that. So you have a gun that feels
you have a memento as well.
Which is another thing that just has no useful rules application.
That was a vibe thing, and it was just a big list of things that are evocative for story or backstory, in a sort of, why does your character have this kind of way? And I think next to none of them would have any kind of mechanical benefit at all, but they're all really interesting, unique, and storied things that would immediately become a sort of, ooh, what's that about your character when the players either meet or they explain their characters to one another at the table. And we wanted to infuse the character creation with something where you made your character and you were excited to play it and explore them alongside the rest of the crew.
That's awesome. I mean, one of the people in the chat who plays the game has said that one of their players has the coat he would die for as his memento. And as you can imagine, that will affect how a game is run if somebody's wearing a coat that they don't want to lose.
I want to know more about that right now. Like that, I know that's not one that's in the book, and that's just one that someone's made up. That's really awesome. I want to know more about that. Like already, if I was in that group, I'd be like, why this coat, and what? Apparently, just had a response saying much discussion about the coat, so it might take up the rest of our podcast time if we do discuss the coat. But that's really cool. That's awesome to hear.
And the final thing that happens in character generation is you also build a ship for you as well that has you sort of make up a backstory for your just beloved junky rubbish ship, because it is not nice. And we made the rules for the game that involve money basically create the situation that you are always going to be just struggling enough to pay your debts and fix the spaceship. And if you don't have a spaceship, you basically can't play the game because you're stuck on one planet.
Okay.
So now you've got to be like, how do we get a ship, or how do we fix our ship, or refuel our ship? We're probably going to need to take a job to do that. And then you do the job, and you'll inevitably incur costs whilst doing the job. Someone will get shot. You'll run out of ammunition. You'll expend fuel driving like a sort of ground-based vehicle from A to B. You'll end up having to pay off crooked cops, something like that. And it just maintains this cycle, which on one hand makes for fun, wacky, oh no, we've got no money kind of thing on a week-by-week, problem of the week sort of basis. But also from like my personal perspective, was also like, it's like Terry Pratchett's boot theory, which was something I was discussing on the Discord, about being poor is expensive, and always fixing things and always buying poorer quality stuff to get something done just ends up incurring further sort of debt, essentially. And that was something that I wanted to capture in the game. And again, it was an idea that I pitched to Zach and was like, poverty and characters always keeping their head just above water, but as a mechanical gauge that is always sort of trying to be balanced, but is always leaning more to one side of being behind by virtue of the player's character's actions. And the only real chance that you ever have of tipping it the other way is if things ever go right. But obviously the fallacy of role-playing game groups is that nothing ever goes to plan. So just by merit of playing the game, you end up creating the impetus for the next session of, we've got to find this bounty. Oh, he's an ace pilot. We'll have to engage him in a dogfight. We do that. Our ship just got wrecked. We need to pay an engineer to fix it, but she's charging a lot. We've got the bounty, but all the money's going to this engineer, and we've ended up back at zero, net zero. And our ship doesn't work, so let's find something to do on this planet.
In our early playtests, we played the game quite a bit before it came out, and there was also an open playtest edition that happened that was about 6 months before the game went on Kickstarter. We used to have actual money in it, and then people got paid and were like, okay, well, what are we doing now? We can afford to retire. And I'm like, no, this is not that game. So the new system we wrote was basically, you rack up how many things would have gotten you some money, but how many things also happen during the session that are going to cost you money. And damage and using your spaceship are things on that list, as well as
just travel between planets is on that list.
I don't think this is a galaxy with universal healthcare.
No, it is not.
It doesn't sound that way. It doesn't have that vibe.
And so if you manage to make ends meet, you can do one little nice thing with the money you made that session that might be definitely fix the ship or get a new gun. But if you don't, you're going to have to start borrowing money from people, letting your spaceship just not be fixed for a while, which is something that was always happening in the kind of shows we were looking at. And it basically means that your character the spaceship is basically the extra character, the first and most important character in all the adventures. And it's going to have a name, and that's basically the name the whole campaign is going to be based around. And I cannot exaggerate, we wrote literally hundreds of spaceship names, and only the best 100 actually made it into the book.
I think I sat, I think it was midsummer, and I sat in a park and I just had my phone on me and I just went through so many records and playlists and wrote down songs and albums, books or figures that I thought would make for cool ship names, because I wanted the ships to feel like characters.
Mhm.
One thing that I really loved was Fantasy Flight's Rogue Trader, where you generate a ship, and it is huge. What you do with that, you make a ship to house your crew. Obviously, in the Warhammer 40k universe, where Rogue Trader's set, ships are colossal, and you can have like cults living in the vents, or your ship is possessed by a malicious machine spirit that does not like the captain. And I loved that. Once you'd rolled up, the ship was as much a part of the party as any one of your players were. And in Cowboy Bebop, the name of the show comes from their ship, the Bebop. Also the same for Firefly. But I'm going to let you in on another little secret in that I actually, despite writing this game, do not like Firefly.
I gasp.
Or Joss Whedon. And people are like, oh boy, this is just like Firefly. And I'm like, yeah, sure. I don't know. I made it like halfway through an episode, and Nathan Fillion just something about him just grinds my gears, and I was like, okay, yeah, if you love Firefly, then sure, yeah, it's like Firefly.
Yeah,
but my favorite reference for it was
yeah.
very much like Bebop, Western films. The writing of like Jim Harrison or like other pulpy Americana. People in the chat saying I knew there was something off about you.
Yeah,
yes,
the chat does not like your hate for Firefly. I'm sorry.
I'm a fraud. I apologize to everyone. I've made it halfway through an episode of Firefly, and I was like, "This stinks of Joss Whedon. No, I cannot." So
you've also said that like Tarantino and stuff like that, and bits of, was it Larry Elmore? And also Guy Ritchie and stuff like that also feel into the
sort of like grindhouse kind of thing, and I welcome that
criminal
comparison, albeit not the comparison to Quentin Tarantino. So people said in college I used to look like him, which was like really. I was like, what? I didn't see it. Maybe my face has changed, but I think that like there's merit to be taken in being able to create those touchstones with people of, is it like X? And I always say to people whenever they pitch me games or tell me about things that they're working on, whether they're, established industry titans or they're just someone I know who's just noodling with something, I'm always just kind of like, not to cut you off, but can you give me an elevator pitch? What is it like? Is it X meets Y? Is it inspired by Z kind of thing? And I sort of, when I do conventions, I just sort of like, hey, what's the sort of games that you're into? What other kind of media are you into? And from there, you can sort of be like, oh, this is like X, this is like Y. And Cowboy Bebop, Firefly, Guardians of the Galaxy, they're like big pieces of media that any one of those three you can relate to. You can use one of them to relate to someone who's into tabletop role-playing games.
Definitely,
Orbital Blues can do all three of them. There are no aliens, and as far as the Guardians of the Galaxy aspect goes, this was like a huge point of contention. No contention, but like discussion during the game's writing.
I wanted aliens, and Sam didn't.
And Sam said no.
It's not that
Why
I was
did you
against
say no?
aliens. But I felt like if we opened up aliens as a thing in the setting, they would either be recolored people, as is the case in like Star Trek, or they would be like super weird. And ultimately it came down to a case of we're telling people's stories, whether they're blue people, red people, whatever. We're telling people's stories. But we also don't have a lot of room to work with in terms of lore or world building. We want evocation, we want tone, we want a sort of, I don't know, a whiff of like, or a fragrance of a world that you can go, oh yeah, I sort of like get that.
Yeah.
I felt like if you introduced aliens, you'd have to explain like alien lore. Where do these aliens fit in? What was first contact? You open a door that I think not a lot of people realize how deep the room beyond that door has to go to make it feel authentic. Like if you look at D&D races, all of them have lore pertaining to how they came about, how they interact with each other. And some people love that. Like, I love games that have like really deep lore. But we wanted something.
Orbital Blues is not that game, right?
No.
Yeah, I was about to say.
And I don't
it's
make
not,
games like that, despite loving them. I can't. I think I'd become like some Alan Moore looking dude with a huge beard, long hair that just shuts himself away and writes all day and never appears to the public. But I wanted it to be sort of like evocative, and essentially it came down to just drawing a line under it. And I don't think it made the cut in the end, but there was going to be a sidebar that said, if you want to include aliens, go ahead.
I think it's in there. I remember reading that.
We've not included them because they're not the stories we're interested in telling. I think you can. You know,
totally.
Sure.
I think you absolutely can. And if you want to, you know, introduce sort of like Star Trek style, these guys they're just like people, but they have tentacle beards and are pink, then go for it. That's dope.
I like the fact it's just people as well, because it echoes back to that feeling of it being like a lonely universe. Do you know what I mean? Because I think we all, well, I certainly, because I'm a nerd, would like the idea that there's other things out there, but if you go out and there's just nothing, it's just more awful capitalist people.
It's a front.
That just feels more sad cowboy, you know.
What's out there? You know, so you got your sad space cowboys looking out from a moon, being like, "What's out there?" Yeah. Oh, planets with rocks and minerals and beautiful vistas on them. And they'll get exploited by capitalism. They'll get turned into strip mines, and you know, sort of people will be made miserable there through work and turmoil. There won't be some funky telepath alien that will dismantle capitalism for you out there.
We spent all of our word count on vibes-based storytelling rather than lore-based storytelling. There is no information in the book about like what the central galactic government is, or you know, how the systems of fiscal and politics work. All we know is that hypercapitalism is a thing. Technology follows rules that we've set out that are basically, it's going to be mass produced, it's not going to work, and it's going to be kind of funky and retro looking, and sort of, it's the kind of thing you can. The spaceships in Orbital Blues are the kind of thing that I've not bothered saying how the FTL engine works, but I know that if you hit it 3 times on the side of a hammer, it's going to work, right?
Yeah.
That's the energy. And there is an adventure included in the core book, and we're working on more of them, but I have no plans to bring them together into cohesive narrative, because I like the idea of everybody's playing an Orbital Blues game in their own little corner of a really big universe that kind of
doesn't care.
The
universe.
The people care very much that you exist, but the universe and the systems of control and government don't. You know, and that's what I found so magnetic about. And there is lore in places that you can kind of catch bits of a narrative coming together. There are certain companies that we reference throughout several adventures. So there definitely is a universe, a combined universe out there, but it's the same thing with the music, because I know that Josh has his own music he listens to while working on Orbital Blues, which is different to what we do as the two creators, as the 3 co-creators. We all have different ideas of what the lore is, and we all have different ideas of what the technology is, and we all have different ideas about what the music is. And it means that whenever we do something, as long as it doesn't break the internal laws of our universe,
I think the tenets are, it's mass produced, it probably doesn't work very well. You've got one, everyone's got one. It might not even be real, as far as even if it is mass produced. It looks kind of old. It's probably beige. It's got analog components, keyboards click, screens are tinged with some kind of color, and
people still use cassette tapes.
Yeah.
All
There's
of your
a big branded
income.
label on it somewhere as well.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah. It's that kind of thing. I remember distinctly, I think there was a whole afternoon taken up where Josh had done a picture of some cargo ships, and we spoke about what the thrusters should look like, and we were like, it shouldn't be too high techy. And I feel like if people see blue thrusters, they think like high sci-fi. Let's do red, something that looks like it'd be like smoggy and smoky, and looks like it stinks of sort of gasoline, rather than something clean. This is definitely not like this is not a green version of space exploration. This is dirty, and it costs lots of space dollars and exploited a lot of workers, and everyone involved is kind of, the spectacle of exploring space has been lost to the drudgery of, oh, my job is being an ore miner for rocket fuels and rare metals kind of thing. It's just kind of, it's a really bummed out universe where, as I mentioned earlier, the only thing out there is more planets for people to be miserable on in different ways, rather than an alien will be there and, I don't know, do something cool for you. It's not even that hopeful.
Well, that's a lovely bleak note, I think, to sell the game on for Orbital Blues. So if you're interested, if we've convinced you that you also want to be a sad cowboy, you can of course pick that up on the Soul Muppet store. So that's soulmuppet-store.co.uk, and also on Drive-Thru RPG if you search for Orbital Blues, and I've got the link on the screen there, and I'll also put it in the chat if you would like to have a look on there, because the best way to support indie tabletop RPG creators is to buy their stuff. So that should be the thing to do. If you have any other questions, because we're running up to the end of the hour here, I'm sure you can get in touch with the Soul Muppet team. Where's the best place to get in touch with you folks if people have questions?
So if you go to the store, there is a Discord server that we are all on all the time. That's
Excellent.
The best way to get us. I am on most places as the Jelly Muppet, which is the name it's the Muppet from where Soul Muppet comes from, and it's kind of me.
Okay.
Sam, what's the best place to find you?
I can be atted in the Soul Muppet Discord under the Orbital Blues sections, or you can follow me on Twitter at Sam Sleney, just all one word, because it's a unique surname and it's never taken. So I just go by that everywhere. Type that in, you'll probably find me or my estranged father. Don't engage with him.
Okay, well, good to know. Good to know. We'll just use that handle that we put there. And if you're listening to the podcast, they'll all be in the show notes, those links there. So the question I'll do before we move on is I'll ask to Sam and Zach, are there any questions you wish I'd asked you, or anything you want to say about Orbital Blues that you didn't get the chance to? Or if we covered it?
I think we've covered it. We've talked about how we make characters, the kind of vibes we were looking for. Is this game good for people who usually play D&D and are maybe looking to branch out? My answer is yes. Rather than your fantasy fare, this is sci-fi, but it's really accessible sci-fi. I myself have found that a lot of sci-fi games are like really clunky, very mechanical based, very sort of very table-y, very numbers centric. And if you want that sort of like more character drama focus, better as a one shot or as a campaign, says Nia Put Peanut. My answer would be it can work as both. The adventure in the book that I wrote is meant to be a sandbox, and so you can take one location from that and run it as a one shot, or all of the locations are webbed together into like this big narrative web of intrigue where one NPC in one place might be the person that someone in another place is looking for, or the unassuming suitcase that you find in the hotel room in one place is actually chock full of money that someone at another location wants. That is very good for one-shots or starting off long-term campaigns. The game shines in terms of character drama with campaigns, and shines in terms of its ease of access and mechanical lightness in one-shots. So, yeah, either.
Yeah, either's fine. We do have another adventure that you can grab on the Soul Muppet store called 160 Acres, which is literally just based on the Marty Robbins song. It's a one-shot pamphlet, and that is everything you need to run your session. And that's what I'd go to if you're looking to put a little one-shot together. That's one that me and a couple of my pals wrote a few weeks ago. But yeah, you'll get the full experience if you play in a long-term campaign, because you'll get a bunch of those character mechanics that we were talking about for long-term progression and slowly running out of money and being in debt. But you'll still have a great time playing it as a one-shot. You just won't get to see all of those long-term character creation rules. But that might be quite helpful if you're just trying to run a short session. It allows the complexity to be built into the game over time. So yeah, it works for either.
Awesome.
I don't think I had any questions I wanted to ask Jess, but I would say that we are working constantly on more things at Soul Muppet, both Orbital Blues and also our other game, Best Left Buried, and lots of other things. So there's the main thing that I work on, as well as writing my own games, is our store, which has like nearly 100 different books on it now that you can buy. We have a UK web store where most of our stock is, but we do shipping across the world, and we have a special US warehouse with discounts on shipping, so you can get it nice and cheap. You don't have to worry about us Brits being on the wrong side of the channel and you not being able to pick your stuff up if you are in the States. And yeah, a lot of our work there goes into focusing on giving access to print and market to creators who might not have it otherwise. So you'll see a lot of indie games that you can buy at us and from us on our store, and aren't available in many other places. So it's a good place to look if you're interested in finding out more about role-playing games.
Excellent. I'll certainly be chatting to you, Zach, as well, to get some of those other indie creators on here so we can talk about their games on Not D&D. Someone asked in the comments, we'll be making this into a podcast so you can listen to it later on for sure. But we are coming up to the end of the hour, so I'm going to say thank you very much for giving us your time, Sam and Zach. Thank you so much for sharing your game with us.
Thank you. I've really enjoyed
it.
this.
No worries. Had a great one.
Fantastic.
There was one thing which didn't come up because my camera angle was wrong, but if we'd been asked about what we were working on in the future, I left a clue in the background, and if anyone can identify that very low-res book by my bedside, they'll have an idea in regards to what it is.
I think your name's covering it up.
Is it? Oh, no.
Hang on, if I do it like... Maybe if I spotlight you there.
Oh, spotlight me, yeah. If anyone can recognize that Penguin Classic in the background, or the cover of it, even though it's partially obscured by my lamp, that was going to be my little...
Sam, stop announcing games.
I'm not announcing games, Zach. That's the thing. I'm not announcing games. I am teasing games in the background.
Do you know what, Zach?
I'm
gonna end the stream before Sam announces something for you that you don't want him
before
to.
I end up committing Zach.
I'm gonna end the stream. So thank you so much for coming on, and to everyone watching, thank you so much. This will be available as a podcast as well if you go look at Not D&D wherever you listen to podcasts there. But that's all for this week. Next week we have another guest on. We're getting paranoid next week with Paranoia. So we're talking specifically about the upcoming Paranoia Perfect Edition. So if you're interested in that, if you come along here, we'll be live streaming every Monday at 10 p.m. BST, or you can catch up with the podcast whenever you like. So that's all for this week. Thank you very much, and goodbye.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.